together. It's 7 days a week, 7 hours a day. They just became one. Huh?
It didn't last that long. Problems.
You ready, Captain? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Dick Forliano, and thank you for coming out. This night is going to be so much fun. It actually started when I was 9 years old. As a little boy, I'm a carpetbagger. I didn't grow up in Eastchester. I grew up in Pelham. And in 1954 was the 300th anniversary of Pelham. And today's Glover Field back then was called Stinkfield, because the tide would come in and the tide would go out. And when the tide went out, it used to smell. But back then, I saw the massacre of Ann Hutchinson, and that was my first experience with living history. I taught in Eastchester for 37 years, and I would take, in 1987, I took 90 kids to Boston, and I went to the Plymouth Plantation, where Shakespearean actors would recreate what it was like for the Pilgrims. Then in 1991, for the bicentennial of the Bill of Rights, I wanted to play a Revolutionary War character, so I had Bunny Rappaport buy a theatrical costume, and for years I've been doing living history. In 2008, the Chamber of Commerce asked for a living history tour. So I developed scripts for people in Eastchester, Tuckahoe, and Bronxville to come out of places and say what it was like. Tonight, we're going to recognize 6 women who lived their lifespan spans 5 centuries, 400 years. The first person that's going to talk will be Ann Hutchinson, who was born in 1591, and the son and grandson of 2 women who lived barely into the 21st century. So really glad that this will be our first Women's History Night. Now I'd like to introduce to you Ann Hutchinson, the first woman to live the first person of European descent to live in Eastchester. If you look behind the back wall, that's a picture that we have of Ann Hutchinson. Actually, there is really this was just some artist recreation. While we don't know much about what Ann Hutchinson looked like, we know a tremendous amount of what she did. And Becca Gemmons is going to play Ann Hutchinson. Ann, would you like to come up, please? You're the first person to live in this town. Your father ran afoul of James I. You are the 3rd daughter, and your father was put under house arrest. Not only did your father teach you to read and write, very unusual for the age, but he also gave you a great background in Calvinist and Lutheran theology. So please tell us how you and your family came to live in Eastchester. Leave England and come to live in Massachusetts. I'm sorry.
At the age of 41, I, my husband Will, and our 11 children and some of my husband's relatives came to Boston in the year of our Lord 1634. We were following our beloved minister, John Cotton, so that we could worship our faith without fear of persecution. While in Massachusetts, I had 4 more children, became a midwife for those giving birth, and I also held meetings on Sunday after services to analyze the sermons of the ministers who ruled our colony.
But when you came here, you were only here for 4 years, but in that time, you became a very important person in the colony. You were charismatic, but also strong-willed. but the ministers found a lot of your views hard to accept. But the colony started to divide. You were admired by the women for your skills as a midwife, your 15 children, your wealth, and a husband who adored you. And after only 4 years, you were put on trial. Why were you put on trial?
Well, as a young girl, my father taught me that I had to do what I felt in my heart was right. And to my dismay, many of the prominent ministers of the colony were not following God's will. They mistreated the Native Americans, who were here first, and they slaughtered innocent, old men, women, and children during the Pequot War. That's one of my children.
There are more seats up here, Captain. And that's my wife doing the babysitting.
Thank her. They imposed such strict punishments for the most minor of infractions like whipping and branding. And they used the Bible to justify their unjust rule. A woman who had given birth to a baby who died of birth defects was chastised for consorting with the devil, implying that her child's death was her fault. I developed my own following who believed what I believed.
You were brought on trial before the clergy who rule the colony, who felt that they were putting a beacon on the hill for all mankind to see. And you were accused of heresy. The punishment could have been death. What happened during your trial?
Well, right before the trial, John Winthrop and the other ministers in the colonies came to me and said all the charges would be dropped if I simply agreed that I had made an error. All would be forgiven. But my family and I did not cross the Atlantic and settle in this frozen wilderness to be forced to worship God in a manner that offended my conscience. I had the unqualified support of my husband, so I refused. Then the ministers who put me on trial, pregnant and tired, made the mistake of questioning my theology and my interpretation of the Bible. Point by point, I went through the scriptures and I proved that my faith teaches a covenant of grace, not works. I then insisted that the ministers making accusations against me would take an oath on the Bible in solidarity with those accusations. They refused. Quoting scripture, I had proved my innocence to the court.
But then you made a fatal error. Well, it wasn't a fatal error to you, but it was to the ministers. You said you were getting direct revelations from God, and you were found guilty. You followed the faith of your convictions, and you were banished from the colony. What happened after that?
My family was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In a blinding 6-day April snowstorm, me and my children set out to join my husband in Rhode Island. I preached more in Rhode Island than I did in Boston, but then tragedy struck. My beloved Will, who considered me a dear saint and servant of God, passed away. I was afraid that Massachusetts would take over Rhode Island and persecute me again, so in 1642, I took 9 of my children and a party of 7 to the Dutch colony of the New Netherlands, where I would be free to practice my religious beliefs without interference from the state. In the course of 8 years, I was forced to cross the Atlantic, settle in Boston, move to Rhode Island, and then settle again in the Dutch colony near the city of New Amsterdam.
On June 20th, 1643, Anne Hutchinson and her party were massacred on the land that later would become Eastchester. Anne was not a feminist, but was a strong-willed and courageous person who lived up to her principles. I'm stealing this last quote from Out of the Wilderness, our book that we wrote for the 350th anniversary. Anne Hutchinson, while not a feminist, was a religious visionary, born too soon in the body of the wrong gender. Let's give Becca a round of applause. She's going to be, I'll let you go off to church now. I'm sorry about that. Becca, too, like Anne, is pregnant. Her father was a minister, and she did a great job. And now we move on to our next person. School children all over America know about, there's some seats up here if anybody needs it. All over America know about Anne Hutchinson. 25 years ago, I met the Mount Vernon historian. His name was Larry Spurl. Larry Spurl was spending a tremendous amount of time in Eastchester because a lot of people don't know it, but Mount Vernon from 1850 to 1892 was a village in the town of Eastchester. Before it, it was farmland. And Larry was tracing the African American roots. And he discovered documents that blew my mind. There was one document in 1672 where Moses Hoyt was selling one of his slaves up in Fairfield, Connecticut. By the 18th century, 10% of the population were African American slaves. But Larry didn't stop there. He discovered a woman named Rebecca Turner, born during the American Revolution, who lived throughout the Civil War. And just recently, a few months ago, Larry and I met again at St. Paul's Church, dedicating the Rebecca Turner School in Mount Vernon. But I'm not going to tell you anymore because we have Rebecca Turner right here. Oh, Rebecca is going to talk to you because the year is 1827, 51 years after the Declaration of Independence. The state of New York officially emancipated all its slaves. And Rebecca is going to talk to her two daughters about her story. Rebecca?
In the year 1781, after the American War for Independence, I was born in Eastchester, New York. I would remain a servant until my 29th birthday. We'll more about that later. My father, Nat, and my mother, Hannah, my father was Nat Franklin and my mother was Hannah Franklin. My father, Nat, fought alongside his master, Judge John Thomas, a Quaker by faith. Sadly, Judge Thomas was kidnapped by the British, and he died in March of 1777 in a New York City prison. There were scores of slaves in Eastchester. 1 out of every 10 colored people were in bondage. They worked for some of the more affluent families, like the Pinckneys, the Wards, the Fowlers, the Drakes, and the Morgans. Some of those slave owners' ancestors were those who put their marks on the Eastchester covenant. Our town was devastated by the revolution. Many families had to flee, even some of the enslaved. Houses were burned. Wheat fields and cornfields lay dormant. Sawmills and grist mills were idle. Livestock just roamed around the town. The most trusting Eastchester farmers now feared everyone and trusted no one. With Master John Thomas gone, Nat, Hannah, and myself became the property of Miss Gloriana Franklin, Judge Thomas's daughter, and her husband James. Gloriana was also a Quaker by faith and believed that everybody was equal under the sight of God. So on my 29th birthday, I was manumitted. I was given my freedom, my blessed freedom. However, my parents and my sisters remained the property of Gloriana Franklin, but she provided very generously for us in her will. To my faithful servants, Nat and Hannah, I give $750 for them to purchase land of their own. And another $75, 45 of which should be used to purchase oxen to help them till the land. Apologies. On this 4th of July, 1827, slavery no longer exists in New York State. Free at last, the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal has become a reality. Our entire family was now free. I met my husband, Benjamin Turner, a free man, around the same time that I became emancipated. What a strong and hard-working man he was. He was the town pounder for St. Paul's. I was a laundress and a cook. We were respected members of our Eastchester community. Our children attended the local schools and Sunday school at St. Paul's. We were respected members of the St. Paul's community.
You were fortunate in many ways. You had your own farm, your own house, and then after your husband passed away, you supported all your children, outliving some of them.
Yes.
But what was life like for the other freed blacks who were not as fortunate as you?
Benjamin and I were very, very fortunate. We owned our own land. We were respected by the community that we lived in. Many of the other slaves found it very hard to find labor. They were given menial tasks, hard labor on the farms, laundry services, that kind of thing. We were fortunate in that our story, we remained on our land for over 100 years, and our story has been captured by historians, and they have some insight into our life. That is why we are most fortunate.
You lived through 3 wars,
Yes.
4 wars. American Revolution when you were born, War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Civil War. You have a wonderful story, Rebecca, and thanks to Dr. Spurl, who discovered it in our records, some of the oldest in America, in New York State. And then Dr. Marilyn Hill, head of the President Emeritus, am I saying that right, Bob?
Yes.
Of the Bronxville Conservancy, wrote a great chapter on Rebecca Turner. But this is a person that the school children in Mount Vernon know about,
Yes.
but it's a person, it's another hero that the people in Eastchester, Bronxville, and Tuckahoe should emulate themselves on. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
These actresses make my life so easy. Because I read out the scripts, and I tell them And I don't know how they remember all their lines. I never could remember lines, and they bring it to life. In 2009, a man named Patrick Buckley, who was working on Ancestry.com, sent me a story about one of his relatives who came to live near Waverly on Tuckahoe Avenue came to America in 1848, and it just blew my mind, because while Rebecca Turner had to overcome the injustices of slavery, Annie Highland had to overcome the wretched persecution of the Irish potato famine. And her story, if I wrote a novel, no one would believe it. But Anne-Marie Flannery is going to play Annie Highland. And the ironic thing about that is you live about 3 doors away from where her house was on Tuckahoe Avenue. But I want to introduce you to Annie Highland, and she's going to tell you her story. Okay.
I was born in Ireland in 1832, and I emigrated to this country from Ireland to England in order to escape An Gorta Mór, which is Gaelic for the Great Hunger.
What do you mean by the Great Hunger?
The Great Hunger is another name for the Irish potato famine. For generations, the English who lorded over us would not allow us to own land, to raise cattle or fish, or to speak Gaelic, our native language. So we were not even allowed to worship in our Catholic faith. We had to pay taxes to the Anglican Church, and we had to give confession and take communion in secret to our priests. And we were not allowed to have meat, only to grow and eat potatoes to survive. So then, when the potato blight hit Ireland, our people died of starvation, and the population of our beautiful island went from 8 million to 6.
How did you get here?
I went to England, emigrated there, and I was working as a servant girl for the family that went by the name of Adams. Their son James fell in love with me and proposed marriage. But his family would not tolerate marriage to a lowly Catholic servant girl like myself. But James chose me, and so he was disowned. We came to this country on a ship called the Columbine with 253 other passengers, and we set sail for New York City and America in 1848. Fortunately, James had a cousin, John Quincy Adams, who lived up county in Bedford. He was a very kind man, and he helped us purchase our farm for $300 from Caleb and Hetty Morgan.
At this time, Irish immigrants fleeing the famine made up 20% of the population of Eastchester. Most of them were employed in the Tuckahoe marble quarries. And tell us about the good and bad parts of your life in Waverly after you and your family arrived in town.
The good part was that we had 3 wonderful children, Harriet, James, and Thomas. Hard-working Irish quarrymen lived here, and their Catholic faith was strong, and so the Church of the Immaculate Conception was established in 1853 in Tuckahoe. And I was able to raise my children in the Catholic faith, and they could go to the one-room schoolhouse. But now the bad part of the story begins. My husband James, he had so much trouble. We worked very hard. He learned to be a farmer, and he learned to be a blacksmith. But he was not raised for this kind of life, and so to feel comfortable he took to drink. And then at the age of 40 he died. And then a few months later, my little Tommy died at the age of 2. I'm sorry I missed them so. And at the time of their deaths, our real estate was valued at $1,500, which was more than most of our neighbors. But still, I was left a widow with 2 children to support. And so, during the Civil War, I had to take in boarders to survive and keep the family going.
What was life like for these men, these quarry workers, your Irish neighbors?
They were very hard workers. They worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day for very low wages. But their faith was strong, and we had a great advantage over our counterparts in New York City, as we could own land and go to school and had the space to live a better life.
Is there anything else we should know?
Well, I have met a man who wants to marry me and will be the stepfather to my children, Harriet and James. So I will soon be leaving this town, but there are still scars here for the Irish. Although I am happy to have lived here, the Irish in New York City and elsewhere don't face the persecution of the British, but we do still feel the sting of discrimination. Throughout New York City, there are signs hung in the shop windows which say no Irish need apply, or simply Nina. But we will bind together, keep our faith, and see to it that our children are educated so that they can have a much better life. Well, it was lovely meeting you all, and I'm going to get my children ready for our new life and for my new marriage, and we're going to head off into New York City to our new life.
The joy of history, including women's history, I always found when I taught, it's a tale of people overcoming tremendous odds and or doing extraordinary things. Our first three speakers did both. Our last woman actress, before we get to more contemporary people, is the famous Amy Dusenberry. She is the last of the Matherton. And Alexander Matherton was the most influential person, an Irish immigrant himself, who really streamlined the marble industry. Amy was a person of privilege, and as she will tell you, it was her duty to help people not as fortunate as herself. She was born when Anne Adams was living in New York City, and Rebecca Turner had already passed away. But I'll let Amy Dusenberry tell her story. Amy?
Young man, I'll let you just sit down and I'll just tell my tale from here. I am Amy Dusenberry, the last descendant of Alexander Masterton, and he was the pioneer who started the marble industry in Tuckahoe. Now I know you're wondering, what year are we in? It's 1934, and we are in the midst of the Great Depression. Marion Perkins and I work together. We share an office at 8 Depot Square. Marion is the Eastchester Neighborhood Association leader, and I am the welfare officer for Eastchester. The first welfare officer, I might add. Now, Marion and I have a very complicated and difficult assignment because, you see, 1 out of 3 people are suffering from unemployment, and 2,000 people are unemployed in our area. There are many, many people starving, and they're dying of freezing in the cold. Now, Marion and I have public monies, federal relief monies, and then we have private charity monies. And we work so carefully to make this money go as far as it possibly can to reach out and help as many people who are out there suffering. These are very difficult times that we are in. In fact, I might add, dangerous. 2 squads of police and the county sheriff and the firefighters had to all come down to the depot square on 2 occasions because the hunger parades were getting out of hand as they came down the hill. They had to stop them from going into riot. Now, these are seriously dangerous times. Together, Marion and I, we do our utmost to alleviate this sense of desperation and poverty. But we also don't want people to become too dependent. We want them to be able to stand up on their own 2 feet. This is a terribly difficult problem, as I'm sure all of you can understand. I want you to know something very important. Just giving a hand out isn't as important as giving a hand up. Now that is something for you to take home with you. That's important moral information. I suppose you're wondering, how did I ever get into this position? Well, I come from a long line of Dusenberry Masterton clan, and they were very caring, very involved people with all their neighbors and all the people who lived in our area, and they have been doing that kind of caring for well over 100 years. My mother, Mary Masterton Dusenberry, used to drive her great big car down into the most difficult places. And she had things to give out. She had clothing and she had food baskets. She even had toys for the children. Well, when they saw her car coming, they rejoiced and they cheered and they welcomed her to the very most difficult places. And that brings us back, because difficult place is exactly where we are right this minute. It is extremely difficult because the public welfare money is not enough, not nearly enough to help the people. So I'm going to be sharing with you some things that we can all do. Those of you who can use a needle and a thread, we have some warm fabrics. I will help you to start some clothing. That clothing will help people who are dying of the cold. And I do want to urge everyone who can possibly go out and gather up fresh milk. Gather it every day, because we have to give it to the children. The children need fresh milk. Now, if you have a little plot of land that you're not using, and we can provide free seeds, that little plot of land can help to extend our unemployment gardens. And they have been extremely successful in the summertime and in the fall. We have brought in many, many crops, and it gives people a sense of self-worth. So just a little plot of land, that would help us. And those of you out there who are homeowners, if you have a little task or a job for people to do, think of our unemployed people. Because if you can give them a little job and a little salary, that will take away one of our people who is draining out our public welfare money. So I'm reminding him, everyone in this room, those who have need to share with those who do not have any wherewithal. And I understand there are many people here who are also suffering some economic reverses. But perhaps you have some clothing you don't need any longer, or some furniture that you're not using. Bring it down to our thrift shop, down at Depot Square. Thank you.